Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's great to have you here. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Thanks for joining us. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you here. Thanks for joining from wherever you're coming from. Today's September 18, 2025. And this is our third webinar in this series focused on a review of a history of scientific forestry. This fall series is part 2 of our 3 parts series examining a history of people, forests, and forestry. This series is co-hosted by the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment, the Forest History Society, the Society of American Foresters, and the University of Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. My name is Gary Dunning, and I'm the Executive Director of the Forest School and the Forest Dialogue, both programs here at the Yale School of the Environment in New Haven, Connecticut, in the US. I'm one of your facilitators for the series, and I'm doing today's introduction. Let me also introduce our other co-host for the series. First is Terry Baker. Terry is the CEO of the Society of American Foresters. Terry's based in Washington, D.C. Our second co-facilitator is Mike Dockery. Dr. Mike Dockery is the Associate Professor of Forest Resources at the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota, where he's based. And our final co-host is Dr. Tanya Moons. Tanya is President and CEO of the Forest History Society, based in Durham, North Carolina, also in the US. So a bit more on the series. As you know, this YFF webinar series will explore histories of people, forests, and forestry. As you can see from the slide, we have a fantastic slate of speakers. We've started off really strong, and we have a great group lined up for the rest of the 4 months. You can see the names of the speakers and their themes there on the screen. Very excited. Just also as a quick reminder, this part 1 of the series last spring was focused on pre-industrial forestry and traditional forestry from many different geographies around the world. So if you didn't catch that, be sure to check out on the Yale Forest Forum website and have access to all those recordings from last spring. And again, a reminder of this series' logistics. This series will convene on Thursdays from 12 to 1 Eastern US time through the beginning of December. The webinar presentations run roughly 30 to 35 minutes or so, with audience Q&A to directly follow. Please submit your questions early using Zoom's Q&A function. Each session is recorded and available on the Yale Forest Forum website shortly after the session. And as always, if you have any questions related to the series, please email us at yff@yale.edu. And now, finally, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Martin Bemmann. Martin is a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Freiburg in Germany. Martin is interested in European history of the 19th and 20th centuries in a global context, as well as in economic and environmental history from a global perspective. Besides the history of wood-based businesses in Europe, he is currently investigating the international research collaboration of the East European socialist countries in the 1970s and 1980s. Recent publications of his include a monograph on the emergence and development of international economic statistics, 2 edited special issues that explore the history of the International Statistical Institute and the relevance of wood-based businesses for the economic development of industrializing, and finally, an essay on national socialist origins of forest-based development schemes of the FAO. Very interesting. So today, Martin's talk is titled "The Times They're A-Changin, Industrialization, Globalization, and Forestry in Central Europe Around 1900." So with that, Martin, I'm very happy to hand it over to you. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. Before I begin, we have to sort out the technical issues because you can't see at the moment any slides of me, but I've prepared some and the team is helping me with, yes. Now you can see it, wonderful. I'm very happy to be part of this series, which is, as you just saw, a quite fascinating lineup. I'm looking forward to listening to the speakers in the next weeks, and I've already listened to Keith and Keiko's talks in the last week and the week before. And apart from learning a lot, I really enjoyed the idea to putting photographs of very nice forests on the first slide, and I decided to do the same. What you can see here is a photograph from a forest from my home village in the German state of Saxony, so in eastern Germany. And what you can see here is a nice stand of beeches in autumn. And the interesting thing here is that if the picture would have taken 100 years earlier or in the late 19th century, we would see only spruces. Yeah, so this forest would be a great example at which we can see how forests in Central Europe have changed significantly from the 18th century onwards to the present. But this would be, yes, a different story. Today, I'm continuing, so to say, the tour de force through the history of scientific forestry that Keith and Keiko began in the first 2 talks of this series. You will certainly recollect some of the topics both of them have already highlighted. The fears of wood scarcity, for example, is one of them, the question of state control another. So there are several aspects that turn up again and again in the course of history. You will also remember Keiko's references towards the enlightened foresters of France who wrote whole book series on forestry in the 18th century. Now, these debates were eagerly followed in the German-speaking countries of Central Europe, on which I will concentrate today. Louis Duhamel du Monceau's lengthy treatises on the topic were translated within 2 years into German, and they were widely read in the mid-18th century. And you will remember that Keiko mentioned that it were 8 volumes, yeah, and they were translated in a very short time. And still today they are available in many of Germany's libraries, and there are even reprints. There were even reprints a couple of years ago. Keiko also mentioned Hans Carl von Carlowitz, who wrote in the early 18th century and who German foresters laud as the inventor of sustainability up to this day. I think as a historian, this is a good example for invented traditions in a certain way. And one reason for this is that the high tide of classical forestry in Germany began only 6 to 7 decades later, at a turn to the 19th century. You probably will be familiar with names like Georg Ludwig Hartig, Gottlieb König, or Heinrich Kotter. They established a system of forestry that was based on both scientific research and the powers of states. Their ideas reshaped forest landscapes in Central Europe significantly, and they also influenced forest-related thinking and acting in larger parts of Europe and the larger world. the 19th century, nonetheless, have rightly described by historians as one that transformed the world. And this is also true for the world of forestry. It changed significantly, especially towards the last 3 decades of the century. And this is where my talks links up. Next slide, please. In early September 1890, over 300 forest scientists and forestry officials from many European countries, but also from North America, convened in Vienna for an international congress. According to Congress reports, one of the most controversial discussions dealt with the question whether it would still be necessary in the current economic circumstances to hold on to the concept of so-called strict sustainability. This concept meant that planning and management of forests were supposed to secure a permanent annual yield of a certain amount of wood out of a given forest area. Adolf von Guttenberg and Eugen Ostwald, 2 forestry professors from Vienna and Riga, then still in the Russian Empire, presented papers on the issue that were followed by lively or very agitated debates, as different reports noted later. The controversy was provoked by the claims the 2 speakers had made. They opined that in the modern times they were living in, the need for strict sustainability was outdated for most forms of forest ownerships, including state forests. Given that wood products were traded internationally, they proposed more flexible forms of management that were more adapted to capitalist and industrial dynamics. Eventually, the Congress adopted a slightly alleviated resolution, but the participants still acknowledged that modern times needed a new understanding of sustainability. At first glance, these papers appear remarkable, maybe even surprising. Presented by senior forest scientists in the heartlands of classical forestry, they questioned one of its core principles, sustainability. In the following minutes, I will try to explain why their remarks were not as surprising as they seem. They reflect economic, social, political, environmental, and also ideological changes that Europe witnessed in the second half of the 19th century, and again, that of course impacted on how contemporaries conceptualized forests and their role in modern societies. Industrialization and globalization are the most important historiographical buzzwords for these processes. They altered forest landscapes. They legitimized forest management as the best way to use them. They turned forestry into a quite lucrative business whose main task was to produce timber. They led to shifts in the understanding and the practices of forest management. They triggered new ways to generate knowledge, and they turned the supply of industrial wood into an object of national and international resource policies. The next slide, please. Thanks. For substantiating these claims, I outlined today in a first step how industrialization impacted on Central European forests and forestry. Second, I contextualized the mentioned 2 papers in a more general and in the longer debate of forest experts that took place in Europe, North America, but also at least a bit in Japan. And third, I will summarize some important consequences these debates and societal changes had for the political, the economic, and the academic framing and handling of forests. Next slide, please. As we all know, industrialization was based on cotton, on coal, and on steel. But it was also built on a multitude of other materials that were needed in ever-increasing quantities, including wood. Without pit props, there would have been no coal mining. Without sleepers, there would have been no railways. Without wooden boxes and barrels, there would have been no long-distance trades. Without wooden poles, there would have been no telegraph networks. And without wood-based pulp and paper, there would have been no expansion of state bureaucracies, of mass media, or of democratic publics. In a nutshell, wood was of major relevance for industrializing and modernizing societies. And in turn, this means that also the history of forests and forestry must be related to these much more general processes. Next slide, please. The first and most obvious consequence of growing industrial demand was that more wood had to be taken out of Europe's forests. And of course, not wood as such, but mainly wood of coniferous trees with certain characteristics depending on the respective purposes. In Europe, pines, spruces, firs, and larch have been the most important tree species for industrial use. Forests that could provide these woods in good qualities and also in sufficient quantities became very lucrative areas. However, next slide, please. However, practically no country or region that reached a certain level of industrial development could meet its demand from its own forests. This was most obvious in Great Britain or the Netherlands, but also well-forested regions in like France or Eastern France, like Bohemia or Switzerland, became net importers in the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Apart from some exceptional periods, also Germany has been a net importer of wood products since 1864. And this is true, although its forests have become much more productive since then. And this is illustrated by the graph, especially on the right-hand side of the slide. If you look at the orange columns, these are the numbers for net imports, not the imports of Germany, but the net imports of wood products, mainly timber. And the red line shows the proportion, the shares of net imports in the actual consumption of timber in Germany from the 1860s to the First World War. Next slide, please. The industrialization's second impact on Europe's forests was therefore that to an increasing degree, the northern, eastern, and southeastern parts of the continent supplied those amounts of wood or wood products industrial centers could not produce by themselves. Historians have described this as the moving of a timber frontier towards the east and the north. What emerged from this process was a distinct economic space of wood that linked many parts of the continent with each other through flows of wooden materials, through investments, through labor migrations, and also through circulating knowledge. Simultaneously, and next slide, please. Simultaneously, this was a third consequence of industrialization. Classical forest management practices described and propagated in the late 18th century already by the likes of Hartig, König, or Cotta. They were legitimized and became profitable only from the mid-19th century onwards. This was true for the aim of classical forestry to establish high forests with long rotation periods that were meant to produce large-dimensioned industrial timber rather than smaller and diverse woods for manifold uses. Also, the transformation of many Central European forests into ones dominated by coniferous trees was legitimized by industrialization. While at the beginning of the late 18th and early 19th century, this choice was often made due to ecological reasons, industrialization created an ever-increasing demand for such woods. And this made modern forestry also economically meaningful. Last but not least, also some silvicultural activities began to make sense only because of industrialization. Thinning is a case in point. Up to the mid-19th century, this was not a very widespread practice, at least not in a modern sense. Only when technological innovations in pulp making especially established a market for small-dimensioned coniferous woods, thinning became a lucrative business. In these ways, industrialization has changed forests and forestry in Central Europe from the mid-19th century onwards. And the close material, economic, social, infrastructural, and knowledge links across the expanding economic space of wood in Europe meant that industrialization impacted on forests also outside of the industrial centers. In most parts of Europe, forest management practices were introduced by state and private actors at some time before the mid-20th century, mostly following Central European models. Of course, sometimes this was certainly only done on paper, and forests were just exploited. There are many examples for this, especially in East, Central, and Eastern Europe. Often, however, intensive silviculture was established and turned forests into areas that could deliver, especially coniferous woods, for industrial purposes in a more or less sustainable way. Next slide, please. The modern times to which the two forestry professors at the Vienna Congress were referring were obviously characterized by industrialization, and I hope this became clear. Living in a quickly globalizing world was another experience that the participants shared with their contemporaries and that impacted on how they understood forests and forestry. In Vienna, they were discussing how long-distance trade, revolutionized in the preceding decades by railways and steamships, would influence the practice of forestry. And this put the Vienna debate in a more general discourse on the possible future depletion of forests and on the concerns about deforestation that took place mainly in the North Atlantic world from more or less the mid-19th century onwards. You can read more about this debate in other accounts, especially in the accounts of Michael Williams, Christian Lotz, or Stéphane Castonguay. But I would like to outline it nonetheless, because it is important to understand the shifts in Central European forestry thinking at the turn of the 20th century. Next slide, please. From the mid-19th century onwards, publicists and experts raised concerns about the pace of forest clearing in the United States that was driven by the country's rapid economic development and population growth. Frederick Starr of St. Louis published one of the earliest of these warnings in 1866. Quickly, Canadians were voicing similar fears. This was not surprising given the large and further growing amounts of timber exported from their shores to the United States, but also to Britain. This latter country was then important for linking these North American debates to Europe. Britain was not only the world's most industrialized economy at the time, it was also by far the largest importer of roundwood and wood products of all kinds. Several times, the British Parliament addressed the country's wood supplies in the 1870s and 80s. It then discussed the possibilities of introducing forestry on its islands and establishing related state authorities and even forestry schools. Next slide, please. From 1873, a British Business Association published the Timber Trades Journal. From its very first issue, this journal addressed the supply and deforestation aspects. Read by exporters and traders in the whole North and Baltic Sea area, this journal was an important medium to accustom Europeans on the continent with the transatlantic debates. Other ways that did this were European forestry and business journals, as well as congresses and expert meetings. The first international gathering of forestry experts took place in Vienna in 1873. After that, such meetings convened in varying places and in differing frequencies. Next slide, please. At one of them, that took place in Edinburgh in 1884, Peter Symonds, a British citizen, raised fears about the sources of British wood supplies from Scandinavia and the Baltic region. His warnings received significant attention in Europe at the time. By far the biggest excitement, though, was triggered by a lecture of Albert Mellard, head of the French Forestry Administration at the time. In 1900, he used an international forestry congress convened during the World's Fair at Paris to reiterate Symonds' warnings. But this time, the warning related not to Europe or North America alone, but to the entire world. His lecture appeared in the country's most important forestry journal and was a bit later published in an extended form as a pamphlet. And what you can see here on the slide is the title page of this pamphlet. Periodicals around the world summarized Mellard's account in numerous languages. And this ranged from journals in North America, of course, but also in almost all European countries and even in Japan. a summary was published, also in Russia. So expert there, or disallowed experts there to actually discuss the thesis of Millar. Simmons and Millar have invested much efforts to substantiate their warnings. They had compiled available figures on the imports and exports of wood products, as well as on forest areas in numerous countries of all continents, and they then related both parts, so foreign trade figures and forest area figures, to each other. The result seemed very clear to them. The demand for wood products was growing much faster than the world's accessible forests could sustainably supply in the foreseeable future. We are living on a capital that is vanishing rapidly, Simmons wrote in 1884, and 16 years later, Millar concluded, "On marche vers la 17." So we are heading for a scarcity. Both experts demanded to better protect existing forests, and especially to introduce active forest management wherever and whenever possible. And both of them opined that the state should take action to address the approaching global timber famine. Collecting and comparing numbers on forest resources and trade in wood products was not an easy task at the time. Only for few states such figures actually existed. And despite efforts of statisticians and also of forest experts to expand and to internationally standardize such a monitoring, the available data remained rudimentary, very diverse, and partly even contradictory. To criticize such far-reaching analyses like those of Simmons and Millar was therefore relatively easy by referring to the statistical methodology. However, and now the next slide, please. However, the most profound critique was not based on such methodological reasoning. Instead, the German forest scientist Max Endres disagreed about the interpretation of the numbers. Only weeks after Millar had presented his warnings in Paris, Endres congratulated him in a widely read German forestry journal for raising the issue in a broader public. He also welcomed the arduous collection of statistics, and he agreed with his French colleague that trade in and consumption of wood had increased quickly. However, Endres maintained that Millar's conclusion, a global timber famine was looming, was nothing more than a firework display, a spectre that only haunts the imagination of a few overly anxious minds, and this was a quote. According to Endres, Millar had underestimated existing forest reserves and the overall growth of forests. Furthermore, developments in previous years had shown that rising wood prices had always been incentives for private investors to explore and exploit new forest areas. As prices would continue
Hey folks, it seems we might have lost Martin for a moment. Please hang on while we try to get him back. Sorry about that. I think Martin is going to try to reconnect, so please hang on. He'll be back momentarily.
Um,
Hello, Martin. We can
I-
see and hear you. Please.
Great. I'm sorry, I do not know what happened, but I'm feeling like being again in COVID times. So I'm continuing here. So we were at Max Andres and his critique, and he was opposing the opinions of likes like Millar or William Schlich, who had a point that Russia would be a great supplier of and could not be a supplier of European economies. Andres instead argued that the net imports of the whole of Europe could be met solely by the forests of European Russia, and then there would still be the vast and mostly untouched forest of Siberia. Andres' reasoning, as well as that of the two forestry professors Gutenberg and Ostwald several years earlier, reflected not only changes that were driven by industrialization and globalization, it was also indicating ideological rifts within Central European forestry. Experts disagreed about the relationship of state and markets in forest economies and about the actual purpose of forestry. Andres, Gutenberg, and Ostwald were advocates of a rather liberal approach. They did not oppose state intervention or regulations in general, but they believed that market mechanisms were better suited to reconcile the long period thinking of forestry with the much faster dynamics of industrialist economies. Not the delivery of stable annual yields of wood was supposed to be the main aim of forestry, but a stable financial gain. For them, financial stability of a given forest ownership in the long run could include unsustainable forest management in the short term. Next slide, please. Industrialization, globalization, and the growing relevance of liberal thinking help to explain why Gutenberg and Ostwald's request to alter one of the central issues of classical forestry was not as surprising as it initially seemed. Also, Andres' optimistic rejection of the gloomy vision of a looming timber famine fitted into this pattern. It was therefore consequential that such reflections of the changing circumstances also affected practical forestry in Central Europe. A liberal approach that prioritized the financial incomes of forest owners and that diminished the relevance of other forest services had been discussed very controversially by German experts since the mid-19th century. Next slide, please. Even more, Saxony's state forests had been managed according to such a doctrine from the late 1860s onwards. This guy, Max Pressler, was one of the most important intellectual masterminds behind this liberal turn in German state forests. Spruces dominated these forests and were managed intensively in monocultural, same-aged high forests. Because of that, Saxony's state forests belonged to the most productive and financially most successful ones in Central Europe before the First World War. In the 1920s, though, the ecological consequences of these management practices became more and more clear, and the new economic and political circumstances after the war also challenged the old system. However, in the late 19th century, Saxony's economic successes and the almost permanently increasing industrial demand for wood products supported the acceptance of liberal approaches like those advocated by Gutenberg, Ostwald, Andres, or Pressler. This became clear in 1890 when the Vienna Congress adopted Gutenberg's resolution in an alleviated form, and this became also clear in 1908 when the Bavarian parliament changed the state's decade-old forest policy, agreeing to cut more old-growth stands. When a third German country took a similar decision 2 years later, large parts of Europe's most productive forests were subjected to a new understanding of sustainability that differed from classical forestry. Next slide, please. Besides such changes of forest management practices, forest experts, state administrations, and also companies and business associations expanded and intensified their systematic generation of knowledge on forests and also of wood. The establishment of state-financed forest research institutes in Germany began already in the 1860s, but it was quickly copied by other European states. In 1890, several of these institutions from Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and France agreed to establish a common forum to exchange knowledge on forests and to coordinate their future research on an international level. And this was the beginning of UFRO that officially was set up 2 years later in 1892 in Eberswalde. Next slide. The efforts to collect and publish international statistics on the world's forest resources and also on the global trade in wood products were another example of how knowledge generation took a modern shape during this period. As I already said, the success of these statistical efforts remained limited. Nonetheless, statistical accounts like that of Albert Millard in 1900 or similar ones like those of Max Endres published in 1905 or this one which you maybe know published by Raphael Sonn in 1910, they were widely used as reference work and long after the period of the turn to the centuries. In addition, wood research became an object of both fundamental and applied sciences. Britain and the United States were at the forefront of this process, establishing wood research institutes in Dehradun in India in 1906 and in Madison, Wisconsin in 1910. But Germany followed soon. It founded a first laboratory for chemical wood sciences at the Prussian Forest Academy in Eberswalde shortly before the First World War. Next slide, please. A third significant marker of the changing world of forestry was the transformation of wood supplies into an object of national and international resource policies. In Germany, the first sign for this was the forming of nationwide pressure groups and lobby organizations for forestry and for wood-based businesses from the 1870s onwards. When the German government changed course from a free trade to a protectionist policy in the late 1870s, these groups and organizations turned into political players. Depending on their respective interests, they supported or opposed the introduction of import tariffs on wood products, a topic that in Central Europe became a constant object of domestic and international political struggle until after the First World War. At the same time, next slide, please. At the same time, the mentioned debate about the future wood supplies triggered efforts to integrate tropical forests of European colonies, mainly in Africa and Asia, into the wooden resource regimes of the industrializing centers in Europe. From the 1890s onwards, Germany attempted to introduce forest management practices in its colonies in Africa. After 1900, it even sent fact-finding missions of forest experts into the Central African jungle. And Georg Escherich's expedition to Cameroon in 1913 was a case in point. He and other experts were supposed to explore to what extent these forests were actually exploitable and, in the long run, also manageable, in order to sustain the growing demand for wood products in Europe. This, however, proved the mission impossible, as the material characteristics of tropical woods, the ecological, geographical, and climatic properties of these forests, and the social and economic circumstances largely prohibited the integration of the tropics into Europe's wooden resource regimes. Europe remained largely dependent on its own forests for meeting its wood demand. Last but not least, I would like to mention that all of this was not only happening in Central Europe alone, but in practically all industrializing regions. In addition, German, Austrian, and French forestry schools attracted an increasing number of international students that learned the theories and the practices of Central European forestry, and they later sought to introduce or to adapt them to different regional contexts. You will be aware of the prominent examples of the British Empire and, of course, the United States. And there also the Central European forestry schools served as models for similar institutions that came into being at the very same time. So the changes and debates in Central European forestry had repercussions in other world regions too. And as I know that Yale Forestry School is celebrating its 125th anniversary this year, so this is more or less what I'm speaking about. Such processes, next slide, please. Sorry. Such processes of transnational knowledge transfers and adaptations, as well as mutual observations and also nationally connoted academic competition, have also been taken into account if one wants to understand those modern times Gutenberg, Ostwald, and their fellow colleagues at the Vienna Congress were talking about in 1890. Thanks to industrialization and globalization, they witnessed a period of fundamental, rapid, and constant change of almost everything around them. It was therefore only consequential that they also found it necessary and reasonable to discuss changes in the fundamentals of their very subject, and this was sustainability in forestry. Thank you very much for this attention. I'm sorry for the interruption, and I'm now looking forward to your comments and questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Martin. That was an excellent presentation. A lot there for us to digest. If it's okay for you, let's jump right into some of the questions that we're seeing. And a note to the folks attending the webinar, please go ahead and submit any additional questions that you have. Okay, first question. What were the friction points between the different regional powers and the demands of wood elsewhere? How much leverage did wood supply provide? Were there tariffs or trade wars? Interesting.
This is an interesting question on which not so much research has been done by now, I would say. So the last aspect you mentioned in the question, yes, it hints towards what was happening. Tariffs, I mentioned shortly in the talk, tariffs was a major issue from the, maybe from the 1880s onwards in Central Europe, from the 1880s onwards until the Second World War, I would say. And maybe even today we have these problems, but I'm not an expert in this. No, there were these power struggles, and I'm not very familiar with the tariff questions in the whole of Europe. Yes, but what I know of Germany is that that even in Germany it was not clear-cut parties that were taking part in the debate. So of course we had large forest owners that were proponents of introducing tariffs on roundwood, but we even had sawmill owners who were also proponents of import tariffs for roundwood, and I cannot really explain such faction building. So again, there's not so much research on it, but yes, maybe we can leave it at this because I cannot say so much more on tariffs. Apart from tariffs, I do not see so much power politics, at least not in this period. There might be, if you look in other world regions at this time. So I mentioned Japan once in the talk, yes? And Japan, as an industrializing country at that time, was very interested also in getting new sources for its growing wood demand. And Korea, Northern Korea was the place where they looked for it. Because they also needed coniferous woods mainly, and they couldn't get it from the tropical forests more south in this region. So, and there was a fierce power struggle, not only about wood and timber, of course, also on other raw materials, but timber had a part in this. And so, and fueled the inter-imperial conflicts between especially Russia and Japan at this time. And it came to the war, as you surely will know, in 1905. So, and there's a good book on Korean forest policies made by the Japanese at this time, by by Fatman is his name. I forgot it. David Fatman, I think, is called The Seeds of Control. So if you are interested in this side of the story.
Great, thanks for that reference. We'll check it out. Second question. Can you reflect on the similarities and differences between discussions or debates on forest or wood scarcity in the mid to late 1800s to early 1900s and discussions around forest sustainability today?
Wow, this is a
A big one.
large question. Maybe first to the comparison between the older and the not so old wood scarcity debate. Of course, there are similarities. So one similarity is that it is about wood, yes, and that there was fear of a future wood scarcity. So not a really actual wood scarcity at the moment such warnings were uttered, yes. Also, a similarity is that it never took place, yes, and not in earnest. So not in the late 18th century, at least not in Central Europe, and in many parts of Europe as well. There was no wood scarcity in the sense of there is no wood anymore. But of course, there was scarcity of several kinds of woods. Yeah. That had to be transported over long distances, and so there could be scarcities, yes, but not in a general way as it was depicted in older forest histories. And the same is true, I would say, in the late 19th, early 20th century in this debate. Yes, there was the fear that scarcity could come, that a timber famine could come if nothing would change. So, and this is also what can be read in the papers or in the pamphlets I have shown. They opined for introducing forest management, for introducing more state control, or to make state control more stricter. Yeah, so these are the proposals the experts had made at that time. And this is also a similarity to the late 18th century, I would say. So the call for the state, and the state took this opportunity, the states took these opportunities to actually expand their state control on forests. So this is also a similarity, I would say. Thinking about differences, it's more difficult to find them. So of course there is the large difference that one debate was dealing with local and small regional forest markets or forest demand or timber demands, and the other one in the late 19th century, it was looking at the whole world, so to say, yes. And so this was a difference, and that gave people, optimistic people like Max Endres, of course, the possibility to say, when prices will rise, there will no problems at all, because we have so much forest all over the world. We do not know how much we have. So why should there be any scarcities? Yeah, if we have the price mechanism, everything will go fine. So, and I think this is a bit different from the late 18th century.
Okay.
And
right.
Sorry, the reference to the present, as an historian, I would restrain to make a comment on this, because I'm not really familiar with the current debate.
Okay, understood. All right, third question. Can you speak to the cover slide? Remember your picture of the forest in Saxony. Do you know how the water yield changed over time as a result of conversion from spruce to hardwood?
No, not really. What I can say about this particular forest is that it was already coniferous in the late 18th century, but with deciduous trees in it. And at the very place that I showed you, there originally were also deciduous trees, and then they were recovered by spruces in the 19th century, almost completely. And it is interesting to see these days that maybe up to the mid 20th century, that the responsible foresters dug in. I don't know how to say this in English. Melioration. Yeah, facilities to meliorate, to bring out the water out of the forests, and this indicates that it was there was rather much forest in much water in it, and this has changed completely today. Yeah, today this is it's rather a rather dry area. So this changed, but I think this has more to do with the recent climate change than with the forest cover. But I'm not an expert in this, so I'm sorry that I cannot deliver a better answer to this.
Understood, but it's a really curious question, and I think insight that you gave is very helpful. Next question. Was the blockade by the British during World War I an issue for German forest products imports, or was it enough to get them via land routes?
Yes. So this was not so much an issue. The blockade was a much greater problem for the British themselves, because they were dependent more or less completely. So I think 95% of their timber demand was met with imports. Yes, and most of them at the time, at the 1912, 1913, was coming from the Baltic Sea area. Yeah, and this was blockaded by the Central Powers, by Germany and its allies. So, and not vice versa. So, and German forests were well equipped, and Germany could also make use of Polish and or what is today in Eastern Poland, the forests there could make use of them. So there was not really a scarcity for the Germans. Of course, they complained about possible scarcities in the future, and they made their mind up about how they can cope with the war situation. And of course, there were the problems with infrastructure, with transport, and so on, but not really. So the impact of the First World War on Germans or Central European forests was not as big as what you might think it was.
Okay. Bear with me. This is a bit of a longer question, but it's a really good one. In North America, there is a recognition of the broader value of the forest beyond timber supply, leading to a gradual, albeit slow, transition to ecological forestry since the 1990s. The questioner is wondering when this transition occurred in Europe or in Germany. If this transition happened much earlier in Europe, what are your thoughts on why sustained yield forestry was still practiced in North America for so long, if it was phased out to ecological forestry a lot earlier in Europe? So you get the question?
Yes, if I understood it correctly, it is about whether, and if so, when ecological or ideas of ecological forestry came up in Europe, yes?
Yes, compared to in North America.
When it began only in the 1990s.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Yes, there is a long discussion about maybe today we would say ecological forestry. Close to nature forestry maybe is a better expression for this. And it started already in the 19th century. Even the likes of Heinrich Cotta and other of the so-called forestry classics, there were proponents of mixed forests, but they couldn't establish them at that time. And then industrialization came and made these coniferous, high-stand, monocultural forests economically viable. So, and in the late 19th century, Carl Geyer is a name that one should have in mind when discussing this. Carl Geyer wrote a book I think in the 1870s or 1880s about, it's called The Mixed Forest, so Der gemischte Wald, the mixed forest. And yes, he made an argument for a mixed forest, for close to nature forestry, because he saw the ecological downfalls of classical forestry, or of how forestry was made in Central Europe in the mid to late 19th century. So, and I would say there are waves of such debates on nature or close to nature forestry in Germany, but also in other parts of Central Europe from time to time. High tides were, for example, then again in the 1920s and 1940s again. And then we have it resurface in the 1980s, 1990s, maybe at the same time as in the United States as well. And in Europe, we have also, especially by private forest owners, they had the possibility to apply such concepts into their own forests, and they did so. So there were examples where such close to nature forestry was actually introduced. And of course, they became sites for forest researchers to look at. So what's happening there? Are these forests better off economically, but also ecologically, and so on? So yes, there is not only a debate with very differing ideas of how to do this and what to do, but there were also the practical application of such ideas in Central Europe.
Okay.
Long before, since the 19th century.
Do you equate the concept or term scientific forestry with sustained yield forestry?
I'm sorry?
Do you equate the concept or term scientific forestry with sustained yield forestry? As it's used in Europe, if it's used in Europe?
I never have thought about this question. Maybe yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to explore that later. Okay, we'll move on. In the efforts of intensive silviculture in the latter part of the 19th century, how is planting happening, or who is doing it?
We do not know so much about the actual work in the forest, at least not as historians, in that time. From what I know is that it was, as possibly everywhere, very labor intensive. We had scientifically educated foresters who were responsible for private or for state forests, and they directed partly hundreds of workers who did this actual planting. But I cannot say so much about numbers or who was involved. I think at least in the early 20th century, it was more or less, at least in the larger forests, wage workers. But you see, and you hear me, so much more I cannot say on this.
Okay. Let's see if we can get in one or two more. Are any of these foresters, so during this time, are any of these foresters talking about the impacts of colonization on indigenous communities and lands? Are they incorporating any ideas that they're getting from indigenous people and these colonies into practice back at home?
This is an interesting question because colonization is not only taking place abroad, but also in Europe itself. And Jeffrey Wilson has written a very nice book several years ago about German forestry, or the German forest, I think is the title. And he has a chapter in it about the colonial attitudes of German, especially Prussian foresters in the Polish settled areas of Prussia, so what is now Poland. And I think it would be worth to look at these examples in Europe itself for such questions. This also applies to the Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because they also dealt with what is today Ukraine. So it's the Carpathians, and the northern part of the Carpathians were very important deliverer of raw materials, of roundwood at that time. And the people there were mainly working in the woods. So, and they were dealt with like all.
Hmm. Sorry, folks. Looks like we might have lost Martin there. I think we'll go ahead and close. Sorry about that, but thanks to Martin for that excellent presentation and discussion with the Q&A. There was a great question about when Germans started wearing uniforms in the forest, German foresters. I would have loved to have Martin answer that. But anyway, maybe next time. Couple things to wrap up. A reminder that today's presentation will be available in several days on the Forest Forum website. That's so that we can make sure that we have professional captioning and making these recordings and videos more accessible. So stay tuned for those. The slides, Martin's slides, will be made available on the Forest Forum website immediately as well. So check back. Next speaker. So continue to join us on Thursdays from 12 to 1 US time. Next week, we'll hear from Jameson Carnes, Jameson is the assistant research director at the West on Fire. But Jameson is going to be talking with us about Dietrich Brandis and the impact of scientific forestry or forestry being brought over to India. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be very exciting.